if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with.
I don't care what age you are, there will be very few of you who haven't at least heard of The Wizard of Oz. Perhaps not the original series of books, but the 1939 film adaptation. An iconic movie that has stood the test of time, probably better than anything else of that age, and in many ways quite revolutionary for cinema. I'd been eager to see The Wizard of Oz for quite a while because, despite vaguely knowing the concept and knowing it enough to reference it in my Star Wars video, I'd never actually seen it, so I sat down to give it a watch, and yeah, admittedly the film is dated a little in the sense of its structure. It's much more a kind of classic fairy tale mythic structure than any driving narrative expected of modern cinema, obviously. I think that is true, and I can understand why some people might find sections of this film a little boring as a result. However, I do think a lot of what doesn't stand up technically by today's storytelling standards is also what makes this film so meaningful. We'll discuss some of those points along the way, as well as its meaning as a whole, but let's begin with the summary in case you don't know it or haven't seen it since you were like 5. Dorothy is a girl living on a farm in Kansas with an aunt and uncle and a dog called Toto, only there's an issue because Toto keeps running into the garden of scowling Lady Miss Gulch, who won't have this, and then claims the dog bit her. So she comes to the farm with an order from the sheriff that she is to take the dog and have it destroyed because it's dangerous. Dorothy wants her aunt and uncle to protest, but it's the sheriff's orders, so they hand Toto over. Dorothy runs off to her room in despair. Only Toto is a very smart dog. He has the brains to escape and rush back home to Dorothy, who is delighted. However, realising Miss Gulch will of course return, she chooses to run away with Toto. She doesn't run far though. She comes to an encounter with a fortune teller named Professor Marvel, who tricks her with the fake premonition that her aunt is currently sick with grief and worry at the loss of Dorothy. Feeling guilty, Dorothy quickly rushes back home where there is a terrible storm now brewing. She gets knocked out when the window smashes and she wakes up in the strange land of Oz. All of which is only really the introduction for the film, but all quite important to the meaning. From there, she finds that in travelling to Oz via her house in the storm, she's crushed and killed the Wicked Witch of the East, where she then gets her magical ruby red slippers, only there's still a Wicked Witch of the West, who isn't happy, and will kill Dorothy for those slippers when she gets the chance.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too.
Basically, if Dorothy wants to get home, she should travel to the Great Wizard of Oz in Emerald City because he'll know what to do. So off she goes, meeting a straw man, a tin man and a cowardly lion along the way, who all agree to also travel to the wizard in the hopes he'll give the straw man a brain, the tin man a heart and the lion some courage. Only when they get to Emerald City, things aren't quite as simple as they'd hoped. What if the Great Wizard of Oz answer to all their problems isn't so great as he'd first appeared to be?
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain!
So I think the more general meaning of this film is pretty easy to follow. Dorothy, like her 3 companions, all have their quest to seek out the Wizard of Oz to essentially grant their wishes. Like taking a pilgrimage, like seeking out a wise guru or praying to a god, or just whatever aims and ambitions we pin our life's happiness upon. In fact, the 3 songs of her companions emphasise this point very strongly.
If I only had a brain, if I only had a heart, if I only had the nerve.
If only I had this clear thing I've always hoped for, then my life would be complete and everything would be perfect. The curious thing, however, is that all throughout the story, the straw man with supposedly no brains has been coming up with good ideas. The tin man without a heart has been crying and showing great wealth of emotion, and as much as the lion might cower and cling to people, he also does consistently face up to every danger and fear. They all already have the things they'd hoped for, they just don't realise it. It takes the Wizard of Oz awarding the straw man a diploma, the tin man a clear object of a heart and the lion a medal for them to kind of recognise this. And I like this idea for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's typical of us to seek out a clear explanation for our discontentment by putting the things we desire at a distance, pinning it all on this one clear hope. I mean, if there's just a clear, concrete thing we lack, then at least our natural discontentment is easier to wrap our head around. You know, we chase an ideal rather than learning to accept ourselves as we are, and accept that maybe, sometimes, it's okay to not feel perfectly happy. Sometimes even sadness is natural and serves a purpose. But I also like this idea secondly because a clear desire gives us a quest to try and achieve, even if we may never achieve it. To put it one way, Dorothy and her journey to Emerald City gives the straw man a reason to get down from his post, or she puts the oil into the Tin Man's joints. Previously they'd been standing around doing nothing, where now her dreamy idea of the Emerald City and the great and powerful Oz gives them a reason to journey. Perhaps all three of them would be more apt in singing, "If Only I Had a Quest." Which is a great conflict I think we can have. How much are the little quests we undertake in our own lives worthwhile journeys of passion and growth and development, where we might otherwise just be frozen as listlessly as the straw man on his post, or the Tin Man literally paralysed, or the lion lost? And on the other hand, how much are these quests a means to run from recognising what we already have? Running from self-acceptance by placing a desire upon a distant hill? It's a tough one to answer, but hopefully we'll get to it by discussing Dorothy. We see this exact same conflict within Dorothy's quest, though also different in several ways. Because as much as she might arrive in the land of Oz and want to get back home to the aunt she's worried is sick with grief, wondering where Dorothy's gone, or as much as she's told she needs to go home because it's not safe here with the Wicked Witch after her, she also kind of wants to be in Oz at the same time. I mean, sure, consciously all she wants to do is go home, and she cries at the thought of not being able to. However, we also get the iconic song right near the beginning of the film, "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," in which Dorothy sings of dreamily wishing to live in another, more perfect and wonderful world. Which is a beautiful song, by the way, arguably the standout moment in the film, despite the fact it's before any of the Wonder of Oz, because this song is what gives the film a lot of its heart. And so, when the threat of Miss Gulch wanting to destroy Toto means she has to run away with her dog, she's quite happy and excited about the journey. There's probably some small part of her that's quite pleased to be given an excuse and a reason for running away. She wants adventure. I mean, of course she does, she's a young girl. And even when she gets to Professor Marvel and he attempts to predict why she's running away, he says,
"They don't understand you at home. They don't appreciate you. You want to see other lands, big cities, big mountains, big oceans."
Why, it's just like you could read what was inside him.
Protecting Toto doesn't even get mentioned as a reason for running away, because deep down, he isn't the motivation, he's more just the catalyst. Or when we get to Oz, we have this wonderful shot where the camera moves through the door and then leaves Dorothy behind to get lost in the wonder of the surroundings, enhanced even more by this change from everything previously being filmed in sepia to now bright, vibrant colours, which is such a great artistic touch to add to the film. I really like that about this. Getting home to Aunt Em isn't Dorothy's first thought. In fact, it's not something she mentions for quite a while here. Instead, she's happily looking around at the surroundings, as we are as an audience, and saying,
"We must be over the rainbow,"
just like she wished for. So then this is her desire, surely. Not to go home, but to explore a new world, where her three companions want to visit the Wizard of Oz in Emerald in order for a brain, a heart and courage. Dorothy wants more integrally to visit the Wizard of Oz in Emerald City for the sake of seeing Emerald City and meeting the Wizard of Oz. This desire to explore and see more is in conflict with a motivation to accept herself and life as it is back home, right? Well, eventually, yes, but to begin with, this side of her that does want to go home has nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with guilt. Let's consider when Dorothy first runs away, she doesn't think of or mention anything about going home at first. She asks to travel the world with Professor Marvel, to which he says he'll consult his crystal ball. He gets her to close her eyes so he can sneak a look at her belongings, sees a photo of Aunt Em, and then uses that to effectively trick Dorothy. He makes up a vision about Aunt Em sick with grief, distraught, wondering where Dorothy is, basically guilt-tripping Dorothy into going back home out of the fear and guilt that Aunt Em might die otherwise and it'll all be Dorothy's fault. It's not until this trick that she mentions going home at all, and so what it means when we get to the wider adventure of Oz is that she's conflicted at first, not between the desire for adventure and the idea of self-acceptance and contentment represented with the metaphor of home.
There's no place like home.
But that she's conflicted between her desire for adventure and her guilt that she should be the devoted daughter back at home, that her aunt will be dying without her.
She may be dying, and it's all my fault.
Look, I've only seen this film once, but I imagine quite a Freudian analysis could and probably has been made here about the child-parent relationship. Even if these aren't actually Dorothy's biological parents. I mean, there's no mention of them in the film. In fact, that probably makes it more meaningful. There can be a difficulty growing up and finding independence from your parental figures where you desire to strike out on your own and find adventure and prove you're better than how misunderstood and unappreciated you feel at home.
They don't appreciate you.
Whilst at the same time there's guilt about this. Is that what a bad daughter would want? Am I selfish to want to strike out on my own? If my parental figures have been so devoted and caring to me, shouldn't I do the same in return?
I had the measles once, and she stayed right by me every minute. Aunt was so good to me, and I never appreciated it.
You know, which is true. It's good to appreciate the care we're given, but it doesn't mean we aren't allowed and shouldn't wish to break away. Arguably, all the care our parental figures give us is intended to grow us into dependent beings capable of breaking away. Instead, Professor Marvel has made this pretty weak trick to guilt her into going home, and the fact she does so easily and deeply fall for such a weak trick probably suggests this is a guilt and fear she already has deep down, which would suggest she's not quite ready for independence yet. She's still too young, maybe. She desires, she plays at seeking it, but she hasn't yet allowed herself the space to truly seek it. She keeps this desire of hers a secondary one behind being a devoted daughter. And I think deep down we can kind of tell she wasn't truly running away or really seeking that, because all she packed was a tiny basket with very little in, most notably a picture of Aunt Em. So on the one hand, she is right. She has been a bit selfish, and it is pretty cruel to just run off without a single word. Obviously that wouldn't be good if she did properly run away. On the other hand, why such extreme guilt about essentially travelling down the road a few hours from home? Aunt Em didn't actually even realise Dorothy was gone until Dorothy's about 2 minutes away from being back. Why the insistence that
she may be dying, and it's all my fault?
You know, growing up, finding independence on some level does naturally mean hurting your parents a little bit. The side of them that wants to hold you close forever. Being made to let go a little more does hurt them, and if we're afraid of that independence, we can be wrought with fears of guilt around them being sick with grief without us, or things going terribly wrong like some out of the nowhere storm that decimates the farm. What if everything goes wrong because I was selfish and it's all my fault? You know, the unconscious, almost superstitious feeling that what we see as our own selfishness is going to be punished by the world. In situations that do naturally occur where our parental figures do get sick or frail or die, we can sometimes have that slight feeling. If I was a better son or daughter, maybe this wouldn't have happened. It's my fault for not loving them more while they were alive. There's nothing wrong in that feeling, it's just one of those difficult emotions we can have. But Dorothy's extreme guilt, just how incredibly deeply she falls for Professor Marvel's trick, which is only meant to be some basically good way to get her to go back home where she's safe. She falls for it so badly and is so certain something terrible will be happening to her aunt and that it will all be her fault. I think it tells us she is so far still afraid to seek independence, and that fear is projected so that it becomes, my aunt and uncle need me, I have to stay close because they won't survive without me, rather than what it really is, I'm afraid to be without them, I want them to not be able to survive without me kind of thing. Obviously in reality there might be something more as well, but we can only go with what the film shows us. Or perhaps with what the film implies too. Dorothy lives with her aunt and uncle. Her parents are given no mention, to which we might speculate they've died. If that is the case, perhaps it might link to this fear about Aunt Em dying without Dorothy around. Perhaps she's still carrying guilt from her parents' death, believing on some unconscious level that they died because she wasn't a devoted enough daughter, and so maybe all this comes from the fear of that same experience happening again. Maybe. I mean, let's think about Dorothy's anger here. She loves her dog Toto. She wants her aunt and uncle to protect Toto in the face of Miss Gulch. But they don't.
We can't go against the law, Dorothy. I'm afraid poor Toto will have to go.
They don't even really put up much argument. Aunt Em could tell Miss Gulch what she thinks of her, but...
Well, being a Christian woman, I can't say it.
And her uncle does nothing more than just take his hat off and relax into a chair. Sure, the law is the law, however, naturally, Dorothy, like any child in this situation, would be furious with her aunt and uncle. They failed her. Running away is also a rebellion and a rage against her aunt and uncle, perhaps wanting them to feel hurt, perhaps even the Great Storm is a metaphor for her rage too, uncontrollable and let loose, and arguably wish fulfillment in the sense this storm is what kills the Wicked Witch of the East, who is symbolically linked to Miss Gulch. But the rage against her aunt and uncle, perhaps suppressed, is definitely there in Dorothy, which, of course, again would make the guilt even worse, because now, what if it's that fury you had towards Aunt Em that made her sick? What if it's your anger that did it? There was some part of you that wished to hurt her, and now that's actually happening, you're terrified you might have caused it. In which case, of course it feels the world would be punishing you, of course you'd be stuck feeling guilty, because you're also punishing yourself. And I could faintly touch on the Oedipus complex here, whilst it's not exactly the same. At the Oedipal stage, growing up, your rivalry and sense of frustration at your parents can leave children with some unconscious fantasies about their parents dying. Not because they actually want them to die, a child's ordinary understanding of death is just someone not being around. It's a simple fantasy and a dream of what if they weren't here, would things be easier? You know, sometimes kids get angry and they say it, I wish you were dead. In many ways it's quite natural. However, if, say, those parents then did actually die for whatever reason, the child might be left with a feeling of guilt. There was a very small, very unconscious bit of them that wished for this. Did I cause it? Did me wishing for this make it happen? Maybe that time I got angry and said, or even just thought, I wish you were dead. Maybe that was actually some magic spell that made it come true, and how crippling that guilt can be, and how difficult a stage of grief to process. Dorothy probably has already lost her parents after all, so what if the guilt we see around Aunt Em is an experience mirroring what she's already gone through once before at a younger age? Rage towards her parental figures, the way any of us naturally do at times, but then the terrible guilt that follows because of this rage, and because of feeling a guilt and a self-punishment over her parents' death. Arguably, we do see all of this in Dorothy. That's why, whilst it's taken me an age to explain, it's important to the story. The interesting thing about the ending of this film is that it almost cycles back into where we were at the beginning, with Professor Marvel, the fake fortune teller who pulls this trick that sends Dorothy running home in fear. She almost falls for a similar trick again that it takes Toto to save her from. First, in pulling back the curtain so that she notices this time the wizard figure isn't really a wizard, but secondly, after the wizard has nonetheless agreed to take Dorothy home in a hot air balloon, Toto jumps out the basket, forcing Dorothy to jump out and for the balloon to leave without her. Toto is a damn smart dog and like a guide in this film who always knows the exact thing to do and the exact path for Dorothy to take. In many ways he's Dorothy's wise intuition who knows but can't consciously express it with a voice. Perhaps Glinda is right when she remarks,
Well, is that the witch?
but taking the hot air balloon home with the wizards, assuming it does actually go back to Kansas, would mean repeating the fortune teller scene all over again, in a way, running back out of guilt and fear, not out of truly wanting to go home yet. She'd still have this desire and have half her heart longing for Oz again, because she would have stopped herself right before the adventure's true conclusion, right before she learns what Glinda explains.
She had to learn it for herself.
What have you learned, Dorothy?
That it wasn't enough just to want to see Uncle Henry and Auntie Em. And it's that if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with. Is that right?
She had to learn that adventure, even to somewhere as wonderful as Emerald City, won't bring her to a place of total fulfillment. Nowhere over the Rainbow Wood. That's kind of the fulfilling lesson in itself. She had to effectively travel the bright yellow brick road of enlightenment to an almost sacred city with a divine looking figure in order to realise that it won't bring her fulfillment, that nothing outside of herself will, because there isn't enlightenment there. It has to be found within. If she had swept back home with the wizard, she wouldn't have learned this, because he'd have been giving her her desire, or so it would feel. She'd be falling for the trick, just as we've seen her companions all fall for the trick with a diploma and a medal and a heart that ticks. They've been tricked into believing they've been given fulfillment by this external presence, and that ultimately denies them from the realisation that it's always been there internally, deep down. And so in not returning with the wizard and not settling for what he offers, she is given this last moment to reflect and to recognise that. And it's in this moment that, finally, going home is no longer about her guilt set against her desire, because her desire to adventure has found its closure now. Which means now going home can be about self-acceptance and contentment and belonging. She effectively travelled the 7 seas and came to terms with the imperfection of the greater world in order to recognise the beauty of her own backyard, of her home, herself. As Glinda is right to say, had she told Dorothy this before, she wouldn't have believed me. She had to learn it for herself. And so if we do return to that tough question of when are these little quests we undertake in our lives journeys of purpose and passion, or when are they a means to run from self-acceptance, I think this is the film's answer. We need to take those quests to their conclusion in order to recognise that we never needed them. If we didn't run these quests and follow our little ambitions, we'd always still be half longing for them rather than finding contentment in what we have. That's probably true, provided it is a lesson we do stop to learn at the end of the quest rather than one we repeat over and over, which it's far from guaranteed that we do. Honestly, it's a lesson I am yet to learn, and perhaps never truly will until I'm an old man. Youth is so filled with ambitions and desire to explore that it's hard to sometimes find fulfillment in the present. Sometimes I feel like I have it, but not always. Hopefully it's a lesson I'll learn to increasing awareness as I get older and continue to mature. Who knows? Having talked about the grander themes, I think let's step back for a moment to talk about some of the smaller, more symbolic or mythic moments here. For example, I love the strawman's clever plan of getting the trees apples by taunting them until they throw the apples out of anger at Dorothy. I guess there's just quite a nice analogy about using the things thrown at us in insult or misfortune and turning them into something more fortunate. How weapons meant to hurt us can become a nourishing fruit. Obviously, the great and powerful Oz, simply as a man behind a curtain, is a metaphor infinitely applicable to situations in our own lives. Like, I tend to think how often politicians talk themselves up like saviours to right all wrongs, or cult leader type figures who provide the answers, or Dr. Phil. How all of them could easily be saying,
"Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain."
But like in their first meeting with Oz, they don't notice his trick because they're too caught up in their fears or insecurities to actually stop to question anything and to think beyond their worries. He asks them,
Who are you?
always an anxiety-inducing question to answer, and he belittles them.
You clinking, clanking, clattering collection of colliginous junk!
As is the typical rhetoric often used, pushing focus on a person's flaws and insecurities in order to stop them thinking enough to question the answers you then present to these flaws. And Dorothy introduces herself as
Dorothy! The small and meek.
I don't know, it feels like a nice moment of her not really standing up for herself yet and recognising her power, not having the confidence yet. I like the moment of her falling asleep in the poppy field right before Emerald City as this idea of how it can become easier to rest, safer to, once we see we're almost there. I think that's always true in real life. Sometimes the hardest moments to keep focus are the ones when we're so close to the finishing line because we kind of feel like we've already made it when actually we haven't. I do quite like the fact it takes nothing more than a splash of water to defeat the Wicked Witch, which, talking modern day cinematic drama, is incredibly anticlimactic, and in fact half of what makes the narrative of this film dated, I think, is the fact there is a lack of jeopardy throughout this film. The witch never truly feels like any real danger. She makes a few threats at the start but leaves pretty easily. She vaguely sets the straw on the light before fleeing at another moment. She attempts to send Dorothy to sleep in the poppy fields, but it's a weak attempt, and even when she does capture Dorothy, rather than just killing her straight away or trying to, these things apparently
Must be done delicately.
so she instead sets a sand timer for how long she's got left to live, and it's not explained why. You know, she just makes it very easy for Dorothy to succeed, really. There's zero dramatic tension to any of it, but that's also part of what makes it meaningful, because she proves just as much an illusion as the Wizard of Oz does. This great and terrible threat of the Wicked Witch that's kept people of Oz in a state of submission actually isn't so scary or powerful when we do face our fears and actually stand up to her. Sometimes that and a simple splash of water is all it takes. And similarly about the drama of this film, the wizard suddenly giving them these medals and all sorts as a conclusion to the three companions arc here is again anticlimactic and unfulfilling as a narrative. However, as a myth, it's deeply meaningful because they represent the final trick that Dorothy must not fall for again. And the repetitive structure of just meeting the companions one by one also, without anything else happening at the time, is a bit boring by today's standards, and all of them effectively singing the same song. But that is a much more traditionally mythic structure, like, you know, going through each of the three little pigs one by one, or whatever better examples I can't think of. And the repetitiveness binds them together and emphasises how they're all technically searching for the exact same thing. The thing that's quite fun about this story is that it is all technically a dream. Everything we see in Oz we see foreshadowed in the real world, most obviously with the fact that actors who play the farmers or Miss Gulch or Professor Marvel also play the three companions, the Wicked Witch and the Wizard of Oz. The chicks are foreshadowed by the munchkins hatching out of eggs, obviously the crystal ball, and there's Toto escaping from the basket. Probably others I haven't noticed. It's the sort of thing that, in a literal sense, can mean you chalk down the entire events of the film as coming to mean nothing at all, because everything is technically right back where it started. It was just a dream. Except it rarely ever is just a dream, because even if it was, which is far from conclusive, it's important that Dorothy insists at the end that this wasn't just a dream, but even if it was, she experiences something that mirrored her real life, only it also broke the cycle. It didn't conclude with her falling for Professor Marvel's trick and running home out of guilt this time. She got to imagine and experience what it would be like to break that internal cycle. That opens the door to the idea that maybe you can take a different path in your own life. You know, if you were already able to do that in a fantasy dream version, in a way that did feel real, surely you have the power to do that same thing in reality too. I don't think it is quite as simple as that, but it's a way of internalising a different message here for Dorothy, a different ending to a narrative. If nothing else, you'd hope the experience has shown her that she can have some independence, that everything is still okay when she leaves for a while to explore. Then again, she does end the film saying,
"And I'm not going to leave here ever again, because I love you all."
So, arguably that kind of goes against my interpretation. Maybe I'm wrong about everything. Or maybe it'll just take a little more to fully internalise. Perhaps that's what the subsequent books were for. Or, again, maybe it doesn't go against my interpretation at all. She wants to be there and not leave because she loves them and because she wants to be there. Not needs or has to be. She's not chained to them out of guilt anymore. She's not so dependent that she can't go off exploring and slaying witches should she ever want to again. She's still a young girl. Maybe when she's older she will want to go off again. Maybe she'll want to seek out a different job or find a husband or live somewhere else. But right now, after such a long journey, this is where she wants to be.
There's no place like home.
There's no place like home.
I think The Wizard of Oz is a fantastic film with some great special effects for the time, some mostly good songs, some fun wordplay, and characters that, though quite simplistic, do represent quite vivid archetypes. Yes, it is slightly dated, and I did get a bit bored in places, I won't lie. The section and all the songs in Munchkin Land did go on a bit too long for my liking. Perhaps that's partly because I don't really like musicals anyway, but none of that, however, makes the film any less brilliant, because it is brilliant, and the fact it isn't more dated than just slightly is a miracle considering its age. I am very eager to read the book and then the 13 sequels that were written afterwards. I have no idea what to expect from them. I never even knew there were books until last week. And also to watch the film Return to Oz, an 80s sequel to this film that I'm told is incredibly dark and pretty insane for what it is, so I'm eager to see that too. Maybe I'll make a video about it sometime. As it is, let me know what you think. Let me know where I'm wrong and I should have watched the film a couple more times before making this video. Like it if you liked it though, subscribe, support me on Patreon, and otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Devon, Kestrel, Arwin, Stephen Legg, Janice McMahon, Samara Salsi, Sharikoff2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.